The entire town hall erupted in laughter when the gavel slammed. $10. That's all John Callahan paid for 70 acres of cursed rocky wasteland. They called him a fool to his face. But the laughing stopped dead 6 months later, when John unearthed the strange metallic bump behind the barn. The Oakhaven County Municipal Building smelled of stale coffee and damp wool. It was a miserable Tuesday morning in late October, and the annual tax foreclosure auction was proceeding with its usual grim efficiency. Auctioneer David Gable stood at the podium, adjusting his reading glasses as he surveyed the sparse crowd of local farmers, real estate speculators, and bored retirees. Most of the prime agricultural plots had already been snapped up by corporate agricultural firms. All that remained were the scraps. Item number 42. Gable droned, his voice echoing off the cheap linoleum floor. The old Miller tract, 73 acres zoned agricultural. Opening bid is set at the back. Taxes owed $4,200. Silence hung in the room. Not a single paddle was raised. In the front row, Mayor Thomas Higgins leaned over to whisper something to William Cole, the wealthiest dairy farmer in the county. Both men chuckled. Everyone in Oakhaven knew the Miller tract. It was a notoriously barren patch of land on the eastern ridge, choked with invasive locust trees, cursed with soil that was more limestone than dirt, and completely devoid of a functioning well. The previous owner, a paranoid recluse named Harrison Miller, had allegedly dumped old engine oil and rusted machinery across the property before he died in the late 80s. Since then, the county had repeatedly tried and failed to offload it. "Do I hear 4,000? Gable asked, looking almost apologetic. 3,000. Come on, folks. It's 73 acres. More silence. Mayor Higgins checked his watch, ready to head to the local diner. Any bid? Gable finally sighed, dropping all pretense of auctioneer enthusiasm. The county will accept any nominal bid, just to transfer the deed and get this liability off the municipal ledger. In the back of the room, a chair scraped loudly against the floor. A man stood up. He was in his late 40s, wearing faded denim work pants and a canvas jacket stained with drywall mud. His hands were thick and heavily calloused, the hands of a man who had spent his life fighting against the physical world. This was John Callahan. Once the owner of a moderately successful local construction company, John had been financially decimated by a vicious combination of medical bills from his late wife's illness and a string of unpaid contracts. He had been living in a rented trailer for 3 years, saving every penny he could scrape together from odd handyman jobs. $10, John said. His voice was quiet, but firm. The room went dead silent for a fraction of a second before William Cole barked out a laugh. Within moments, half the room was chuckling. Mayor Higgins turned around, shaking his head with a condescending smirk. "John, be reasonable," Higgins called out over the murmurs. "That land is a toxic rock quarry. You can't grow weeds on it, let alone crops. You're just buying yourself a liability." "I said $10, Mayor," John replied, holding Gable's gaze. "Is it a valid bid or not?" Gable cleared his throat, banging his gavel once. $10 is bid. Do I hear 15? No going once. Going twice. Sold to Mr. Callahan for a $10 bill. As John walked to the clerk's desk to sign the paperwork, the mockery was palpable. He could hear the whispers. Fool. Desperate. Throwing his life away on a rock pile. But John didn't care. He needed land. He needed something that was his, a place where he wasn't answering to a landlord or a bank. He handed over a crisp $10 bill, signed the deed, and walked out into the crisp autumn air. For the first time in years, he felt a strange, terrifying sense of ownership. The reality of the Miller tract was far worse than the rumors. When John drove his battered Ford pickup onto the property the following Monday, he was greeted by a landscape of absolute desolation. The old farmhouse had collapsed onto itself, leaving a dangerous pile of rotting timber and rusted nails. The fields were overgrown with briars as thick as a man's thumb. But the worst part was the ground itself. It was uneven, aggressively rocky, and littered with decades of forgotten debris. For the first 5 months, John lived in a small camper he towed onto the property, waking up before dawn to clear the land by hand. He borrowed a rusted 1970s-era backhoe from a sympathetic former employee and set to work trying to grade the area directly behind the collapsed barn. The locals watched him whenever they drove past the county road. William Cole even made a point of driving his brand-new tractor past the property, shaking his head at the pathetic sight of John wrestling with the stubborn earth. It happened on a rainy Tuesday in early April. The ground was slick with mud, and John was operating the old backhoe trying to uproot a massive dead oak stump that had stubbornly resisted his efforts for a week. He pulled the levers, dropping the bucket deep into the muddy soil beside the stump. He engaged the hydraulics to scoop upward. Instead of the yielding crunch of dirt and roots, a violent metallic clang shuddered through the entire machine. The impact was so severe it rattled John's teeth and stalled the tractor's engine. He sat in the open cab for a moment, the rain pelting against his jacket, listening to the hissing of the overheated exhaust. He had hit rocks before, hundreds of them, but this was different. The sound was hollow, resonant, and unmistakably manufactured. Frowning, John climbed down from the tractor, grabbing a heavy steel shovel from the truck bed. He waded into the knee-deep mud where the backhoe bucket had carved a deep trench. The rain was washing away the loose topsoil, revealing something that made John's breath catch in his throat. It wasn't a pipe. It wasn't an old car chassis. It was a smooth, riveted expanse of dark, heavy steel. John dropped to his knees in the mud, tossing the shovel aside. He used his bare, gloved hands to claw away the earth, his heart hammering against his ribs. The more he dug, the larger the object became. It had a distinct curvature, like the top of a massive, subterranean dome. As he cleared a section about 3 feet wide, his fingers brushed against something protruding from the center. It was a heavy industrial locking mechanism, crusted in decades of rust and dirt. John sat back on his heels, the cold rain soaking through to his skin. He stared at the strange metallic bump protruding from the earth. The town had laughed at him. They had called this land a worthless rock pile. But as John stared at the massive buried steel structure, a chilling realization washed over him. Harrison Miller hadn't been a crazy hoarder, dumping trash to ruin the soil. He had been burying something, and he had been trying to hide it from the rest of the world. The torrential rain continued for 3 days, turning the Miller tract into an impassable swamp. John Callahan used the time to his advantage. He draped massive heavy-duty tarps over the excavation site behind the barn, concealing the steel dome from any prying eyes on the county road. He knew how Oakhaven worked. Small towns operated on a currency of gossip, and if Mayor Higgins or William Cole caught wind that John had found something of potential value, they would use every zoning ordinance and legal loophole in the municipal code to confiscate the land. By Friday, the rain finally broke, leaving behind a thick, humid mist. John drove his pickup into town and parked in front of Dawson's Hardware. He needed supplies, and he needed to buy them without raising suspicion. The bell above the door jingled as he walked in. Peter Dawson, a wiry man with a perpetual squint, looked up from the cash register. "Well, if it isn't the lord of the manor," Peter said, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "How's the rock farming going? John hit bedrock. Yet—" "Just clearing brush, Peter." John replied evenly, keeping his face entirely devoid of emotion. He walked the aisles with purposeful steps, loading a heavy canvas cart. He grabbed a heavy-duty wire wheel for an angle grinder, an industrial crowbar, 3 cans of penetrating oil, and most importantly, a full oxyacetylene cutting torch kit. Peter leaned over the counter as John unloaded the items. The hardware store owner's eyes darted from the heavy pry bars to the cutting torch. "That's some heavy artillery for a brush-clearing job." Peter noted his tone probing. "You find an old tractor buried out there or something?" John handed over his credit card, praying the remaining balance was enough to cover the purchase. "Just taking down the old silos. The metal is warped, and I need to cut it into scrap to haul it away." It was a plausible lie, but John could see the wheels turning in Peter's head. As John loaded his truck, he noticed Mayor Higgins's black SUV slowly cruising down Main Street. The mayor slowed down as he passed the hardware store, his eyes fixed on the oxygen tanks in the bed of John's truck. John turned his back, securing the tailgate, but a knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. The clock was ticking. That night, under the cover of darkness, John fired up a portable generator he had muffled with bales of wet straw. He climbed down into the muddy pit beneath the tarp, the harsh glare of a halogen work light illuminating the metallic bump. He attached the wire wheel to his angle grinder and went to work on the steel dome. For hours, the night air was filled with the shrieking of metal on metal and showers of bright orange sparks. Layer by layer, the decades of hardened earth and oxidized rust began to peel away. By 2 a.m., John wiped the sweat from his forehead and stared at what he had uncovered. It was a hatch. It was perfectly circular, roughly 4 feet in diameter, constructed of military-grade steel. Around the perimeter were massive industrial bolts, and in the center was a recessed wheel similar to a submarine door. Faint stenciled letters were visible beneath the remaining rust. John leaned in close, wiping the metal with a rag soaked in solvent. U.S. Department of Treasury, Internal Revenue, sealed 1931. John's breath hitched. 1931. The height of Prohibition. Oak Haven's local legends had always whispered that the Appalachian foothills were a hotbed for illicit distilleries, but the phrase internal revenue meant this wasn't a bootlegger's crude hideaway. This was a federal seizure vault. Why was it buried on a worthless farm? And more importantly, why had Harrison Miller spent his entire life making sure nobody ever wanted to buy this land? John grabbed the heavy crowbar and jammed it into the center wheel, straining with every ounce of his strength. The wheel didn't budge a millimeter. The locking mechanism was seized solid, fused by nearly a century of moisture and neglect. "All right," John muttered to himself, his voice raspy in the damp air. The hard way. He dragged the oxyacetylene tanks to the edge of the pit and ignited the torch. A blinding, localized blue flame roared to life. John pulled down his welding mask and pressed the tip of the torch against the massive steel locking pins holding the hatch closed. The heat was immediate and oppressive. Molten slag began to drip onto the mud, sizzling and popping as the torch chewed through the ancient steel. It took 3 agonizing hours. John burned through half his fuel and nearly suffered heat exhaustion in the enclosed space beneath the tarp. Finally, at 5:30 a.m., just as the sky began to turn a bruised purple, the final steel pin gave way with a loud metallic crack. John extinguished the torch, gasping for air. He wedged the crowbar under the lip of the heavy hatch and threw his entire body weight backward. With a deep, groaning screech that sounded like a dying animal, the heavy steel hatch levered upward and flopped over onto the mud. A rush of cold, incredibly stale air hit John's face. It smelled of old concrete, dry rot and something else. Something distinctly sweet, rich, and intensely alcoholic. He grabbed an LED flashlight from his tool belt and stepped to the edge of the dark, gaping hole. The beam of light cut through the blackness, revealing a concrete shaft with a rusted iron ladder, bolted to the side, descending about 20 feet straight down into the earth. At the bottom of the shaft, the light reflected off another surface. John swallowed hard. He tested the first rung of the ladder. It held. Slowly, carefully, he climbed down into the abyss. The temperature dropped significantly with every foot he descended. When his boots finally hit the solid concrete floor, he turned the flashlight forward. He was standing in a small antechamber. Directly in front of him was a massive bank-grade vault door. It was painted a dull olive green, but the center combination dial had been violently smashed with a sledgehammer, rendering the lock useless. The heavy steel bolts had been retracted. The door was cracked open just a few inches. John stepped forward, wrapping his fingers around the edge of the thick, cold steel. He took a deep breath, braced his legs, and pulled the massive door open. The hinges screamed in protest, echoing loudly in the subterranean silence. John stepped over the threshold, shining his flashlight into the cavernous room beyond. As the beam swept across the darkness, John Callahan fell to his knees, utterly paralyzed by the sight before him. The $10 farm was a lie. The rock-filled dirt was a lie. The truth was buried right here in the dark, and it was going to tear the town of Oak Haven apart. The flashlight beam swept across the cavernous subterranean room, illuminating a sight that defied all logic and reason. Stacked floor to ceiling, resting on massive rot-resistant cedar racks, were hundreds of heavy oak barrels. The air in the vault was thick with the heavy, intoxicating aroma of aged alcohol and charred wood preserved in the cool, climate-controlled darkness for nearly a century. John Callahan walked slowly down the central aisle, his boots crunching lightly against the dry concrete floor. He approached the nearest rack and wiped a thick layer of pale grey dust from the face of a barrel. Branded deep into the oak was an ornate, old-world seal, Oak Haven Distilling Company, Kentucky Straight Bourbon, barreled November 1919. John's mind raced, struggling to process the magnitude of the discovery. The year 1919 was the eve of Prohibition. Before the Volstead Act outlawed the sale and production of alcohol across the United States, independent distilleries had frantically tried to liquidate their stock. Some, however, chose to hide it, hoping to outlast the federal mandate. But this wasn't just a hidden stash. The vault door, the federal seals, the sheer scale of the operation. This was a government seizure depot that had been completely wiped from the official maps. He continued deeper into the vault, counting the racks. There were easily over 400 barrels. At the far end of the room, tucked behind a stack of shattered wooden crates, John spotted a heavy steel desk. Atop the desk sat a rusted brass kerosene lamp, a dried-out inkwell, and a stack of thick, leather-bound ledger books. John gently pulled the top ledger toward him. The leather was brittle, flaking away under his calloused fingers, but the thick parchment pages inside remained perfectly intact. He opened it to the middle. The meticulous handwritten, cursive-detailed shipments, cash drops, and inventory counts dating from 1924 to 1931. But it was the names listed in the margins that made John's blood run cold. Payment received $4,000 to Sheriff Higgins for road clearance. Distribution cut 15% to W. Cole Sr. for transport logistics. Hush money, $2,500 to County Judge Dawson. John stared at the pages, his pulse pounding a frantic rhythm in his ears. The founding families of Oak Haven, the grandfathers of the very men who had laughed at him in the town hall, were not the upstanding pioneers they claimed to be. They had been the ringleaders of a massive, heavily organized bootlegging syndicate. They had used federal seizure facilities to store their illicit liquor, bribing every official in the county to keep it quiet. And Harrison Miller, the paranoid recluse who owned this land, wasn't crazy. He was the son of the syndicate's bookkeeper. Miller had spent his entire life fiercely protecting the land, terrified that if the town's elite found out he had the ledgers and the bourbon, they would kill him to protect their family legacies. Suddenly, the heavy muffled sound of a diesel engine rumbled through the concrete ceiling above. John froze. He clicked off his flashlight, plunging the vault into absolute darkness. He stood perfectly still, straining his ears. Above ground, a vehicle door slammed shut. Then another. Heavy boots squelched through the thick mud, moving deliberately toward the tarp-covered excavation site. "I'm telling you, Thomas, he's hiding something." A gruff voice echoed down the concrete shaft. It was William Cole. Dawson said he bought cutting torches and industrial grinders. Mayor Thomas Higgins replied, his voice tinny and distant, but unmistakably agitated. "You don't need a cutting torch to clear briars. Pull that tarp back. Let's see what the $10 fool is digging up." Panic flared in John's chest. He had left the massive steel hatch wide open. If Higgins and Cole looked down the shaft, they would see the ladder. They would claim the land was a hazard, seize it immediately under emergency county powers, and John would lose everything again. Moving purely on adrenaline, John sprinted silently across the dark vault. He climbed the rusted iron ladder 2 rungs at a time, his muscles burning as he ascended toward the grey light of the surface. He reached the top of the shaft just as the edge of the heavy tarp was thrown back, revealing the overcast morning sky. Mayor Higgins and William Cole stood at the edge of the pit, their eyes wide with shock as they stared down at the massive open steel hatch. Before they could speak, John hauled himself over the edge, planting his muddy boots firmly on the massive steel lid. He held his heavy crowbar in his right hand, not aggressively, but with enough tension to send a very clear message. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" John asked, his voice dangerously low. "Or is trespassing on private property a new hobby for the town council?" William Cole took a step back, his eyes darting to the crowbar. Mayor Higgins, however, quickly recovered his composure, puffing out his chest. "We received a noise complaint, John, operating heavy machinery at all hours. As mayor, it is my duty to investigate potential zoning violations." Higgins peered past John, trying to look down the dark shaft. "What in God's name is this Callahan? An old bunker." "It's an old septic tank system." John lied smoothly, not breaking eye contact. "Needs to be filled in. Now I suggest you get off my property before I call the state police and have you both cited for trespassing." Higgins narrowed his eyes, a venomous sneer crossing his face. "You listen to me, John. You're in over your head. This land is completely unzoned for deep excavation. I'm issuing an emergency cease and desist order, effective immediately. You are not to touch a single piece of dirt until the county engineers conduct a full site survey." "You have no authority to do that," John shot back. "I run Oak Haven." Higgins sneered. "I have all the authority. We'll be back tomorrow with a court order and the sheriff. Enjoy your $10 mud pit while you still can." The 2 men turned and trudged back to their waiting SUV. John watched them drive away, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. He knew exactly what was happening. Higgins was going to use the town's legal machinery to steal the land before John could officially claim what was underneath it. John had less than 24 hours to secure a fortune, and he was completely alone. By noon, John was sitting in the polished mahogany office of Thomas Abernathy, a ruthless, high-powered property attorney, based in the state capital, 3 hours away from Oak Haven's corrupt jurisdiction. Sitting next to Thomas was Gregory Linwood, a renowned appraiser of antique spirits, whom Thomas had called in as a favor. John had brought 1 bottle's worth of liquid, siphoned from a barrel, into a sterile glass mason jar, along with the brittle, leather-bound ledger. Gregory unscrewed the lid of the mason jar, inhaling deeply. His eyes widened behind his thick spectacles. He took a small glass pipette, placed a single drop of the amber liquid on his tongue, and closed his eyes. "Mr. Callahan," Gregory whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "This is uncut, unfiltered, pre-prohibition wheated bourbon. The aging process stopped the moment the temperature stabilized underground. It is pristine. If there are over 400 barrels of this down there, you are sitting on one of the most significant historical spirit discoveries in American history." Thomas Abernathy leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "And the estimated value? At auction." Gregory swallowed hard. "To private collectors and heritage brands, easily $30 to $40 million. Perhaps more." Silence filled the opulent office. John stared at his calloused, mud-stained hands. $40 million. Less than 48 hours ago, he had been calculating whether he could afford to buy canned soup for the week. "There's a problem," John said, sliding the brittle ledger across the desk toward the attorney. "The local mayor and the biggest landowner in the county are trying to seize the land tomorrow morning under an emergency zoning ordinance. And if they see this book, they'll probably burn the property to the ground, with me inside it." Thomas Abernathy opened the ledger. He read the first few pages, his eyebrows rising steadily toward his hairline. A predatory smile slowly spread across the lawyer's face. "Mr. Callahan, they aren't going to seize your land. In fact, they are going to grant you every permit you could possibly desire." The emergency town hall meeting was called for 9 a.m. the following morning. The room was packed with confused locals who had heard rumors of a standoff at the old Miller tract. Mayor Higgins sat at the center of the council table, flanked by William Cole and the local sheriff. Higgins slammed his gavel, his face flushed with power. "This council hereby calls the matter of the Miller tract to order," Higgins announced loudly. "Due to extreme hazards discovered on the premises, the county is executing an immediate seizure of the property via eminent domain. The owner, John Callahan, will be compensated his original purchase price of $10. The crowd murmured. Before Higgins could strike the gavel to finalize the vote, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open. John Callahan walked down the center aisle. He was no longer wearing his mud-stained work clothes. He wore a sharp, dark suit, tailored to his broad shoulders. Trailing right behind him was Thomas Abernathy, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. "Mr. Callahan, this is a closed council proceeding," Higgins shouted, standing up. "Sheriff, remove these men." "I strongly advise against that, Mayor Thomas Abernathy," said his voice, carrying the calm, booming authority of a courtroom veteran. He stepped up to the microphone. "My name is Thomas Abernathy, lead counsel for Mr. Callahan. We are here to submit a formal objection to the seizure. We also have a filing for the State Attorney General's office that we'd like to share with the room." Abernathy opened his briefcase and pulled out high-resolution photocopies of the 1924 ledger. He handed a stack to the front row, instructing them to pass it back. Then he walked directly up to the council table and placed a copy right in front of Mayor Higgins and William Cole. "My client recently unearthed a subterranean federal storage facility on his property," Abernathy announced to the dead silent room. Inside were documents detailing a massive illegal bootlegging and racketeering syndicate operated by your grandfather, Mayor Higgins, and your grandfather, Mr. Cole. The ledger details thousands of dollars in bribes, extortion, and tax evasion. Higgins's face drained of all color. He stared at his grandfather's unmistakable signature on the copied page. William Cole looked like he was going to be physically sick. "Now," Abernathy continued, his voice dripping with lethal politeness, "if this county seizes Mr. Callahan's land, he will immediately hand the original ledgers over to the IRS and the FBI. Since the wealth of both the Higgins and Cole families was entirely built on this undisclosed illegal enterprise, the federal government will initiate a generational asset forfeiture. They will take your farms, Mr. Cole, They will take your pension, Mayor Higgins. You will both be utterly ruined." The silence in the town hall was absolute. The entire town was staring at their leaders, reading the undeniable proof of their corrupt lineage. John stepped up to the microphone, looking directly into Mayor Higgins's terrified eyes. "But if the county rescinds the seizure order," John said evenly, "and grants me full unrestricted commercial zoning rights to my land, the original ledger stays locked in a bank vault in the capital. Permanently." Higgins opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Cole, who gave a desperate, frantic nod. Higgins swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he picked up the gavel. "The motion to seize the property is withdrawn." Higgins stammered, his voice cracking. "Commercial zoning is approved." He struck the gavel. It sounded like a surrender. 2 years later, the $10 farm was unrecognizable. The briars and rocks were gone, replaced by a pristine state-of-the-art facility, secured by wrought-iron gates and private security. The Miller Tract Heritage Distillery had become a global sensation. John Callahan, the man the town had called a fool, stood on the balcony of his new, sprawling estate overlooking the valley. He raised a glass of perfectly aged century-old bourbon to the setting sun. He had bought a wasteland with a $10 bill, but he had unearthed a legacy that made him the unquestioned king of Oakhaven. John Callahan's incredible journey proves that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden beneath the very ground we are told is worthless. From a $10 joke to a multi-million-dollar bourbon empire, his story is a testament to the power of perseverance and trusting your gut against all odds. If you enjoyed this thrilling real-life farming drama, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing historical discoveries and incredible stories